Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Stefan, more known as Bernardito, and I have the distinct pleasure to be joined by Fraser, also known as Crrpit, who is flared in the Spanish Civil War and the International Brigades.
Hi, Stefan. It's a great pleasure to be doing this recording with you.
Now, we're here to talk about the International Brigades and the Spanish Civil War. But before we do that, I'm very interested to know what got you interested in the International Brigades to begin with?
Sheer luck, to be honest. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Sydney in Australia before moving to the UK, where I'm based at the moment. And there was a system for an undergraduate course where you had to sign up to an essay on the lecturer's door, and then only sort of 10 people could do every question. And I kind of procrastinated this for so long that there was only one question left, which was on the Spanish Civil War. And I kind of reluctantly did it and found that I really loved it and just kind of never really looked back. I just, kept on doing it for my undergraduate dissertation, then master's, and then finally my PhD.
Now, the idea and concept of foreign volunteers in general is still a very, very relevant subject.
I don't know. Is there a 20-year rule on the podcast?
I don't think so.
Yeah, what I find absolutely fascinating about the International Brigades in Spain, aside from, there being inherently interesting individuals who make very interesting decisions and do interesting things, is that you can start drawing these contemporary parallels. And one of the real innovations in the historiography in just the last few years has been this effort to kind of view foreign fighters as a distinct phenomenon in their own right, not just studying groups like the International Brigades who, do one thing, but trying to draw parallels between sort of Spain, even up to the present day in Syria and Iraq. So it's kind of a field which has kind of exploded in sort of popularity and interest alongside, the recent prominence of foreign fighters in contemporary conflicts.
Going back to the Spanish Civil War, I'm interested, what motivated individuals to volunteer to fight in another country's civil war?
Well, I think to understand the motivations, you have to look at what's happening, especially in Europe, over the course of the 1930s. As I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast knows, Mussolini comes to power in Italy in the early 1920s, but it's really with Hitler coming to power in Germany in 1933 that fascism suddenly starts to become this ideology, which isn't just kind of like a quaint thing happening in, relatively minor countries such as Italy, but is now something that's at the heart of the European system fascism starts to look very aggressive. It looks like it's trying to expand and take over the entire continent. And more people over the course of the 1930s realized that fascism is going to lead to another world war. And what this means is that, especially for those on the left, those who fascism tends to persecute, there were efforts to kind of mobilize and prevent the further spread of fascism. And that there are sort of many famous instances of this in a domestic context. So in the UK, where I live, the Battle of Cable Street in 1936 is still very, very well remembered as kind of London's East End kind of rallying together to oppose a fascist march through a Jewish district of London. But what I'm kind of interested in is how those mobilizations crossed borders. So how do you convince someone not just to defend your own neighborhood against fascists, but how do you convince someone to sort of cross borders? And that's really was one of the big research questions of my PhD research, was how do we explain this particular decision to volunteer in Spain? And the difficulty, of course, is that, by, say, 1936, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, Europe has a lot of anti-fascists. A lot of people describe themselves and think of themselves as wanting to oppose fascism. So for me, the big question was, well, how do we get from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are, passionately against the spread of fascism down to just about 32,000 volunteers who come from across Europe? What's the process by which these individuals kind of select themselves? And what I kind of found was that approaching the question by turning it on its head was actually quite useful, because previous scholars, when they've looked at, this very, very large number of anti-fascists and very, very small number of volunteers, have kind of looked for individual explanations. Sort of, what was it about this person's life that made them want to go to Spain? What were their beliefs? What were their kind of personal circumstances? And I kind of took the opposite approach of saying, well, what if they're not just individuals? What if they are, even though they're a small number of people, what if they're still acting collectively? Like, can we find interconnections between them? Can we sort of see perhaps that this decision isn't being made kind of like internally, this kind of, internal struggle about conscience and belief and politics, but maybe it's being made within a more social or communal context. And here I found it really useful to think of a lot of the research that's been done in recent years on sort of voluntary military recruitment in the context of, say, the First World War or the Boer War, where we see, obviously a much larger mobilization of volunteers, particularly in places like Britain. And this research has really highlighted that it's not just an individual decision, it's not just about socioeconomic factors, but it's about this marriage of community and ideology. And what I think is really interesting is that when people volunteer to fight in a conflict, it's almost always because they conceive the conflict as defensive. This makes kind of intuitive sense. We're willing to defend our homes if we need to, but very, very few people are sort of willing to launch a war of aggression on their own terms. That's why we have conscription, I suppose, or that's why we have sort of mercenaries in earlier periods. So what I found was that ideology is that kind of bridging gap. Ideology allows you to redefine what's defensive. So if you're a British person, wanting to volunteer in the Boer War, you can conceive that war as defensive, even though it's blatantly not, because what you're doing is defending the British Empire. So if we look at sort of ideologies of imperialism, sort of married with sort of communal understandings of what the war is about and what the appropriate response to the war is, we can understand why people volunteered to defend something. And I think we can say the same about Spain. People who are part of very specific political communities, which I would say are mostly based around the Communist Party across contexts, can understand going to Spain as an inherently defensive act on a couple of levels. They can see it as maybe trying to prevent the outbreak of the next World War. It sounds retrospective. It sounds like people are just making it up, but people really did sort of go to Spain saying, if we don't stop fascism here, World War II will break out. This is a contemporary motive, even though, of course, they couldn't know for sure that a war was coming. But also, people were aware of what fascism did to communities of people like them. So if you're Jewish, if you're a communist, if you're a socialist, it was fairly apparent, I think, that if fascism came to power where you lived, you were going to be next. And in fact, that's a very famous sort of propaganda poster in Britain regarding the Spanish Civil War, as this sort of picture of dead children from an air raid, and sort of this sort of slogan, your children will be next. And so what we see is this sort of, if you're in the right sort of community, if you're in this right sort of political sort of social sphere, then going to Spain starts to become a defensive act, and it starts to become one in which your community is encouraging you to do, and that these are decisions that you're making alongside your friends and family. And that's one of the really interesting things when you look at a kind of sample group of these volunteers, is that they are interconnected in really meaningful ways. So you get like brothers-in-law, friends, sort of people who, belong to the same branch of the political party or something. They are all doing this together. This decision is getting made in a social context. And for me, that's really interesting, because we then need to start thinking about things like peer pressure. Not that anyone's necessarily being forced to do something they don't want to do, but kind of think about it. If you make a decision sort of by yourself, sitting at home by yourself at night, you can not follow through with that decision very easily. You're only really disappointing yourself. But if you make a decision, down at the pub with a bunch of friends, backing out of that decision the next day becomes very difficult, so long as everyone sort of has the same understanding of what it is you've agreed to. Once you make a decision in a social context, it becomes socially difficult to unmake that decision. And so what I think we see in Spain is we see a lot of latent desire to go to Spain. A lot of people sort of saying, oh yeah, that would be a good idea. This is something that is desirable for people to do, and then actually being put in a position where they can follow through with it.
Now, if it isn't obvious already to the listener, of course, you focus particularly on the British volunteers of the International Brigades. Is that correct?
I actually took an even smaller regional sample. I looked specifically at the Scottish volunteers. There's about maybe 520 of them. And the goal was less, though, to, study Scotland, but more to kind of use this as in a kind of prosopographical sense of saying, okay, well, I'm going to learn as much as I can about this cohesive grouping and use them as a sample to sort of interrogate wider questions about the International Brigades. So for me, there were, while I think Scotland is a really interesting case study, I mean, Scottish political cultures in this period are really, really interesting. And I do, to some extent, consider myself a historian of Scotland. The main aim of my research the last few years has been to kind of use these individuals as kind of allowing for insight into a bigger picture.
In comparison to the Scottish volunteers, just a bit over 500 Swedes joined the International Brigades. Most were sailors, like Erik Wernerås from Blekinge. How did this look in comparison to the Scottish volunteers? What were their professional backgrounds?
Well, it's an interesting question because on one hand, we can say with a great deal of certainty that they were overwhelmingly of very traditional working class backgrounds. These are manual workers. These are guys who work with their hands, who would identify as being working class. And this is a bit different to the kind of established picture in a British context, where we tend to think of guys like George Orwell, middle class, well-educated, writing novels and poetry while they're in Spain. And this is one of the popular images of the International Brigades as being built up. But especially if we look at volunteers from outside the southeast of England, it's simply not the case. I would say about 95% of the Scots come from a very solidly working class background. But what's kind of interesting is that you don't see the same kind of mobilization along occupational lines that you do in the Swedish context or elsewhere in Britain. In the Welsh context, coal mining is very much the sort of occupational grouping that sort of goes to Spain from Wales. And I think that kind of reflects the different ways that politics gets organized in different places. I think that in some parts of the world, politics is very much an occupational identity. Sort of political connections get made in the workplace through trade unionism and so on. In Scotland, it wasn't the case. There are a lot of trade unionists who go to Spain, but they don't know each other from the trade union movement. You don't see clusters of people going from the same trade union branch or the same workplace. And I think this is because most communists in particular who are working in the trade union movement need to do it secretly in Scotland. Because of the Depression, employers have a lot of power over who they hire and who they don't. So if you're a communist, you're likely to get blacklisted from a job. So if you are a communist in the workplace, you tend to keep quiet. You sort of work your way up the ranks through your local trade union, but you're not making friends. You're not getting people to join the party alongside you, which means you can't really get the same kind of community surrounding politics in the workplace in Scotland. In South Wales in particular, that's different because the communism and trade unionism are very tightly intertwined. You get these kind of local, pit identities, which are, as much about being communist as it is about being coal miners, as it is coming from a particular village. And I don't know the Swedish example in as much detail, but I would hazard a guess that it's a similar thing, that you have these political connections that, for whatever reason, are being made in the workplace rather than in another sphere. It's also worth noting, just as a side note, that sailors actually have an easier time getting to Spain for very obvious reasons. I mean, they're much more mobile individuals. They can, get a job in a ship going to Paris, and, well, obviously the ship wouldn't be going right to Paris, but you know what I mean. And this is actually something you kind of see in the Australian sample, where, the Communist Party in most places pays for volunteers to go to Spain. They kind of pay the train or ship tickets, and that helps, people make the journey. But in Australia, it just costs too much to send someone to Spain. The Communist Party couldn't afford to send anyone. And so you again see this overrepresentation of sailors because they're the only ones who had mobility of their own accord. They're the only ones who could easily make it to an overseas destination. So I wonder if in Sweden there's a similar dynamic happening.
Indeed. In the case of Erik Wernerås from Blekinge, he became politically conscious during his time as a sailor. And he himself writes that his experiences in the merchant navy turned him into a socialist. But going back to the volunteers themselves, you've talked about who became a volunteer. Now, the question is, how did they become volunteers? What was the process of actually ending up in Spain?
This is actually really interesting. I mean, in a British context, this is a really interesting question because the legality of doing this, the legality of saying, okay, I'm going to go fight for another country is very, very murky at best. Britain has what's called the Foreign Enlistment Act, the sort of most recent version dated back to 1870, which essentially says you can't join the army of another country if Britain is neutral. And this is in response to the American Civil War, where some British citizens get up to some, kind of naughty stuff, and the British government eventually has to pay reparations. So the volunteers are doing this in the knowledge that they might be breaking the law. And certainly the people recruiting them are doing it in the knowledge that they might be breaking the law. And this means that everyone's very discreet. And what's interesting, if you look at even like the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, you never see an explicit call to arms. You never see sort of, we've got a recruiting booth down in Trafalgar Square, come put your name down. You see a lot of articles which sort of extol the bravery of the volunteers and kind of, implicitly suggest that this will be a good idea for other people to do, but they never give people a roadmap. They never want to leave themselves open to the accusation that they're actively recruiting people, because they think that that's the kind of line in the sand that if they cross that, they're going to get the book thrown at them. So what actually sort of unearthing the recruitment process is surprisingly difficult sometimes. We do have fragments, so we have individual testimony, we have sort of fragments of police reports and so on, so we know a bit about it. And it seems to have mostly been a matter of word of mouth. So if you had a connection to the Communist Party, for instance, you would ask a guy who would know a guy who would tell you to go to this office and speak to this person. What would happen is that once you kind of made yourself known to the right people, you would be told to go to a particular place and you'd be interviewed to go to Spain. And this interview is kind of designed to kind of weed out people who they don't really want. And this, might be, are you an alcoholic? Are you just going to go there and get drunk on sangria all the time? Are you politically unreliable? So are you, well, probably not a fascist, although there was one ex-member of the British Union of Fascists who managed to make it to Spain from my sample. No idea how. But, are you a Trotskyist? Also, are you flaky? Do you have, a wife and 3 kids at home who you're going to miss after a couple of months, then try to leave again? So there is this kind of vetting procedure, which is partially but not completely political. And then once you kind of passed this vetting procedure, you'd be, if you weren't already in London, you'd be sent down to London. And then they would arrange quite a little ingenious method. At the time, if you wanted to spend a weekend in Paris, the so-called dirty weekend for, like young, wealthy men, you didn't need a passport. So long as you had a return ticket to Paris for the weekend, you could get by the border without having to have any kind of passport. You could just use any ID that you wanted to. And so the Communist Party kind of abuses this loophole and buys them all return tickets, for the ferry across from Dover to Calais, and then a train ticket to Paris, bought them the return leg. But of course, once they get to Paris, they stop there and they don't go back. And what happens from there is that there's a whole underground network, spiriting, would-be volunteers from Communist Party headquarters in Paris down south to the Pyrenees. And then after about January 1937, when the French closed the border to volunteers, they start sneaking them across the Pyrenees. So they sort of walk over the Pyrenees at night and sort of come to Spain with the breaking dawn. So it's really quite a well-organized operation. It's run by the Communist International based in Moscow. So they're kind of coordinating the resources of all these different national communist parties, particularly the French Communist Party, to kind of smuggle people from wherever they are into Spain.
Now, how did local Spanish soldiers and Spanish civilians view these volunteers coming from all over the world? What were these relationships or encounters
this is really an immensely complicated question, and one which hasn't really been looked at a huge amount by people who study the International Brigades. I think the people who write about the International Brigades have a tendency to sort of adopt national blinkers almost. They want to study their volunteers and not really how they interacted with other people necessarily. So it's all about, what battles did they fight in? What did they do? But of course, the reality of serving in something like the International Brigades, we've got, about 32,000 volunteers all told, about at least 10,000 at any given time. And they're serving in these units, which are just an absolute hodgepodge of nationalities. After spring 1937, they start introducing Spanish soldiers to sort of make up the numbers. So there's this whole wealth of transnational encounters, which, some of them are absolutely obvious. Obviously, when you go to Spain, you interact with Spanish civilians, and some of them are less obvious. The kind of weird situation that the International Brigades was kind of in, where you do have this truly multinational army. And just because of the sheer variety of these encounters, they're immensely varied. And what tends to happen is that how you characterize them reflects your kind of partisanship in the historiography, because you get people sort of claiming that, the International Brigades were really welcomed, they got on fantastically with the locals, like everyone loved them, and there's a fair degree of truth to that. But you also get people who kind of point to the tensions and sort of say, well, sometimes they were a bit arrogant, sometimes they didn't really respect local Spanish people or local Spanish soldiers, they would get drunk and wreck bars and things, and so there could be a lot of tension with the locals. And my answer, probably predictably, is somewhere in between, that there is a huge amount of goodwill towards the international volunteers. They're kind of, readily appreciated as giving up their lives for the Spanish people. I mean, up to about a quarter of them die in Spain. There's no question that these guys are hit there on holiday. And if you're a supporter of the Republic, you appreciate that sacrifice. You appreciate that solidarity. But equally, there are structural reasons why there was tension throughout their time in Spain, particularly with the soldiers they served alongside. Because you have to think about what the logic of the International Brigades is kind of implicitly, or indeed sometimes explicitly, justified in that the Spanish people, Spanish Republicans, don't have any military experience. This is sort of like an innocent people who didn't fight in the First World War. They don't know what a modern war is like. We'll recruit international people who can teach them how to do it, who'll show them how to do it by example. And of course, this isn't necessarily the reality. I mean, World War I veterans who, this was supposed to be World War I veterans in the International Brigades who would have experience. But of course, World War I veterans are quite old by this stage. So there's relatively few actual military veterans in the International Brigades. They don't actually have more experience than the Spanish soldiers, but they still act like they do. And you also see these kind of like tired old tropes. You're probably familiar with the idea that, Italians, just surrender all the time. Italians make terrible soldiers. And, Germans, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, Germans are great soldiers. And I think it's very easy for International Brigade volunteers to kind of slip into this hierarchical kind of thinking. And they tend to become quite dismissive of Spanish military capabilities. Their opponents, they kind of see as, the Spanish nationalists, they can't fight, but they've got all these Moroccans and Germans and Italians to do it for them, and that's why we're losing. And also reflecting a kind of condescension towards the Spanish Republicans, particularly Spanish Republican conscripts who they're serving alongside for most of their time in Spain. And of course, the Spaniards are well aware of this, and they can't help but resent these assumptions of superiority. And this is particularly bad if you're, say, a Spanish officer who might have been fighting in the Civil War, since the first day it broke out, have months or years more experience of fighting than these volunteers do. And yet they're treating you like the second-class citizen in your own country. And so there are these persistent sort of misunderstandings and assumptions that aren't isolated. They recur throughout the entire time the international volunteers are in Spain. And so we do have to view it as kind of being a structural issue of trying to put together this kind of unique international force. But on the other hand, we do have to acknowledge that people on both sides of this discussion did realize that it was a problem. And the International Brigades do go to a lot of effort to try to alleviate these issues. They try to get the volunteers to learn Spanish. They try to, politically educate them, not to, display what they refer to as national chauvinism. But this is kind of like is kind of like bailing out a boat. The volunteers often kind of revert or, new volunteers who come in have to be taught the same lessons. So it's this constant struggle on the part of the International Brigades leadership and political leadership, and in terms of smoothing over what can be quite troubled relationships between the Spaniards and the international volunteers. And I don't want to suggest that everyone hated each other. That's clearly not the case. And you get some really emotional encounters between them as well, really practical displays of solidarity, Spanish conscripts who'd invite the International Brigade volunteers back to their families' homes and, feed them, amazing dinners in the middle of wartime, the only decent food they really got in Spain, I suspect. And you also get moments sort of when the International Brigades are withdrawn from Spain towards the end of 1938, and they have this big farewell parade in Barcelona. And, you can sort of tell when you listen to oral testimony of people who were there, the international volunteers, they're absolutely blown away by how grateful the population of Barcelona is. They're sort of describing walking down the street and just having girls, run up to them and cover them in kisses and hug them and crying and so on. And so there is this emotional connection on both sides here. So while there could be tension, this was also a way in which going to Spain could be a really affirming experience, particularly if you are a socialist or a communist and you believe in the power of international solidarity. Spain is a place where you can kind of see that in action.
And we do see that in action, considering just how many volunteers there were and from where they came from. So you got people like your Scottish volunteers, or you got people like the Swedes, like Erik Wernerås, or you got people from even further away, like José Gardes Camps from Chile. This begs the question a little bit about this solidarity that you speak of. What were the politics of the International Brigades like? Like, were they under communist domination, as some would accuse them of being? Or, like, did they suppress, dissenting views or other alternative political views?
Politics of the International Brigades are really interesting. They've been a kind of like a historiographical football, because it's kind of like a Cold War litmus test. You look at the International Brigades, you either see, the defenders of liberty against fascism and tyranny, or you see, what one scholar referred to as the Comintern army, Stalin's lackeys there to, set up a, Eastern European-style client state in Spain, to, crush the Spanish people under the thumb of Stalinism. Naturally, I'm going to say the truth is in the middle. There is no doubt whatsoever at this stage, especially now the Soviet archive's been opened, that the Communist Party, or various Communist parties, I should say, were absolutely in control of the International Brigades. The higher leaders were all appointed by the Communist International, the Comintern, who I've already mentioned, and on a sort of battalion level, so these national groupings are all sort of commanded by communists from their home country. So you get British communists running the British battalion, get French communists running the French brigade, and so on and so forth. There is no doubt that communism and the International Brigades are incredibly closely intertwined. What we also have to realize, though, is that this is not, when we think of communism in the 1930s, we think of Stalinism, we think of purges, we think of, immensely cynical abuses of power that are happening within the Soviet Union at the time. What we need to remember, though, is that for those who are communists outside the Soviet Union, the crimes of Stalinism and the problems with Stalinism are not apparent by this stage. I mean, for some it would never become apparent, I suppose you could say. But, there's a lot of idealism left in, communist movements outside the Soviet Union. And most of the people who are communists and who are going to Spain are communists because they see it as more democratic rather than less democratic. They see communism as offering an actual democratic alternative to liberal democracies in the West. And so while they aren't necessarily Democrats in the way that we would think of democracy today, this kind of parliamentary or representative democracy, that's because they see Stalinism as being better, that, it is, Stalinist communism is actually offering a type of democracy which is more democratic in a really fundamental way, that the people that, Stalinist government is actually capable of representing ordinary people in a way that Western liberal democracy didn't seem to be, especially in the 1930s when we see, massive systemic failures, particularly in the economies of Western countries. So I think we need to be careful about how cynical we are about the kind of people who are running the International Brigades, most of them are not kind of power-hungry Stalinists who are, purging everyone left, right, and center. But equally, we need to acknowledge how far just the logic of Stalinism has permeated through the international communist movement. And I think the easiest way to kind of understand this is kind of through this kind of specter of Trotskyism. And, all communists everywhere have been taught that Trotskyists are the enemy. They're kind of betrayers of the revolution. They might look left-wing, but they're secretly fascist. They're working for the enemy. We need to root out Trotskyists wherever we can find them. Otherwise, they're going to bring down the movement from within. And this kind of language of Trotskyism and saboteurs and spies and so on is used in the International Brigades with stunning frequency. So there are these lists that you can find in the Comintern archives of just, lists of names with, one-word descriptors, spy, saboteur, Trotskyist. And this kind of is on one level evidence that, the International Brigades were Stalinist, that they were repressive, they were targeting their own members for political sort of dissent and so on. But what I actually found when I did a bit more digging was that these labels actually had no consequences. So you get people who were labeled as Trotskyists in Spain, whose personnel files, are full of, damning kind of indictments of their character and politics, but who serve quite happily and go home without a scratch. That there's this odd disconnect between labeling something which in the Soviet Union would be a death sentence, but in Spain is just something that sits in a personnel file. And for me, that raises questions about what the actual purpose of this labeling was. Why are they trying to evaluate volunteers' politics? Is it to stamp out dissent in the International Brigades? Or is it another reason? And for me, the most likely reason is actually basically human resources. What these evaluations are intended to do is to provide kind of an indication to the Communist Party, both in Spain and at home, how much responsibility to give people. Can this person be promoted? Are they loyal and dependable? Should we put them in charge of a squadron or a company? Or should, when they get back home to Britain, should we, give them a responsible position on the party committee kind of thing? And so these labels are, a bit certainly over the top, and they speak to kind of this pervasive Stalinism, which is at play, but they're also not meant nearly as maliciously as we might assume with knowledge of the contemporary Soviet Union. And this is kind of a pattern that repeats itself in the International Brigades. I mean, one of the case studies which I worked with was of this guy who died after being assigned to a labor battalion as punishment for trying to desert. And in the Soviet Union, during the Second World War, if you're assigned to a labor battalion, in inverted commas, for trying to desert, that's basically a death sentence, right? We've all seen Enemy at the Gates. These are the guys who are, running forward to clear minefields kind of thing. But what I actually found in Spain was that it wasn't actually true. They actually genuinely meant this guy is going to go dig some trenches or something. This guy has proven he can't be trusted to fight at the front, so we're going to find something else useful for him to do. And so there's this whole language of sort of Stalinism and paranoia and purges and penal battalions that we kind of instinctively apply to what the International Brigades are doing, but isn't actually reflected in the reality so much. What I actually found when I looked at desertion patterns within my sample was that being caught for desertion actually significantly increased volunteers' life expectancy. Only one deserter was ever executed from my sample, and that's not because he deserted, because he tried to desert the enemy. He was sort of prepared to sort of hand over maps that would betray their positions to the enemy, and that's what got him executed. But there are dozens of other deserters who are caught and who get the military equivalent of a slap on the wrist. Most of them are just sent to the rear to do kind of menial labor. A lot of them are sent home even. So there's this kind of disconnect between what we imagine Stalinist repression looking like and what the actual reality was. We do need to allow, though, that there is some self-interest at play here. I mean, particularly if you're a British or American volunteer, the Communist Party is very, very wary about doing anything too harsh to you, because they know that if the tabloid papers pick up that they're shooting volunteers for desertion in Spain, they're going to have an absolute field day. They don't need an excuse to make the Communist Party look bad. So they tend to be very, very restrained in how they treat volunteers who come from kind of Western countries where a free media might mean very, very bad press for them.
I'm very curious to know whether or not in your sample group there were women fighters.
While there were no Scottish women actually fighting in Spain, there was at least one Scottish woman who tried to fight in Spain. So this was Kay Welton, and she wrote a letter to a Scottish communist, a man named Tom Murray, who was going out to Spain in early 1938, essentially asking him to take her with him when he left. And this letter is one of my absolute favourite letters written ever, basically, but certainly within the context of the Spanish Civil War, because Welton is immensely enthusiastic and her logic is amazing. She sort of says, well, look, I've never been trained in first aid. I'd be absolutely useless as a nurse. I would be of no value to the cause, but I think I can learn to shoot a rifle really quickly. So take me with you. Either I learn how to shoot a rifle and I'll be useful to the cause when we come back, or I'll get killed and I won't be a bother to anyone anymore. So there's this immensely sort of enthusiastic but also kind of brutal logic to her kind of plea to be taken to Spain. We don't actually have a reply to this letter. I don't know if one still exists. We can be relatively certain, though, that Kay Welton never actually made it to Spain, which I would say is a pity, but then again, she might have been killed and that would be bad. But, I, for one, very much enjoyed reading her letter. It makes it an absolutely amazing change with kind of somewhat staid prose of Scottish communists to see this incredibly enthusiastic young woman really sort of making this very forceful case that she should be allowed to serve.
When some Swedish volunteers returned to Göteborg in December of 1938, more than 30,000 people awaited their arrival. How did it look when British volunteers returned back home to Britain?
It was very similar. I don't have a crowd estimate for you, but certainly thousands of people came to the station in London when they were sort of coming back from the ferry ride over the Channel. Again, when the Scottish volunteers got home, there were sort of welcome receptions in Glasgow and Edinburgh and their own sort of smaller towns and villages. And they were treated as heroes by a large section of the population. We have to remember, though, that for the left, for those people in Britain who were anti-fascist, by this point, they were undoubtedly heroic. They were fighting in a war which the British government had tried, to kind of wash its hands of. But then we had, the government itself, and for those who were, perhaps more conservative or even centrist, these individuals were seen as something of a danger. You can kind of see the logic, I suppose. They're proven that they're willing to go and fight for their revolutionary beliefs, or at least what were perceived to be revolutionary beliefs. And now they would come home, they'd be trained in using weapons, they were presumably well organized, or presumably politically indoctrinated. Very similar debates that we might recognize from today, although the advent of terrorism today is, I suppose, a different dynamic to it. So there's actually quite a lot of debate in British policy circles, as there were in places like Sweden and everywhere else where the volunteers returned, as in, what do we do with these people? Do they need to be put on a watch list? Do we need to start surveilling them? What happens if they try to join the armed forces was a really big question, especially in 1939 as the Second World War starts to kick off. So there were very big question marks over what the fate of these individuals would be. It's worth noting that no one, despite it, as I mentioned at the start, it technically being illegal to do what they did, no British volunteers were ever charged for going to Spain, so none of them faced kind of prison time for it. But there were efforts to kind of keep them at arm's length, especially when the Second World War gets underway, and especially in the kind of the first year of the war, where it's obviously not quite certain where the Communist Party stands. After the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the Communist Party itself takes an anti-war stance in September 1939. So there's a lot of ambiguity about, are these ex-volunteers subversive? Can they be trusted in the armed forces? Can they be trusted in war industries? Can they be trusted in government jobs? And there's been a fair amount of debate. This is actually something I published on relatively recently about the extent to which this discrimination impacted ex-volunteers during the war. Because there's this kind of what's known as this kind of premature anti-fascist narrative that these individuals had recognized the danger of fascism before anyone else had. They'd gone to fight against it, but they'd done it too soon. They'd done it before society was ready. They'd done it prematurely. So even though the rest of society are now caught up, these volunteers still weren't trusted, even though they were now, nominally all on the same side. Everyone hated fascism now. So there's this kind of resentment that you see among the supporters of the International Brigades that here are, individuals who had been fighting fascism in Spain. They've been fighting against Germans. They've been fighting against Italians. They're experienced. They've got, they know what modern warfare against these enemies is like. Why aren't we using their experience? Why aren't we getting them into the armed forces? Why aren't, they advising our generals kind of thing? What I found in my research, though, is that it's a bit more ambiguous than that. And part of the problem is that when the volunteers sort of come back, by the time the Second World War breaks out, the Spanish Civil War is not the main concern. Because the Communist Party itself is kind of seen as having betrayed its own base in some ways, that, it had recruited all these members on the basis that they're an anti-fascist party, and now suddenly the Soviet Union is cooperating with Germany, and its memberships have been instructed to oppose the war against the Nazis. So what you see is that sort of MI5 takes like a very cautious approach. They kind of say, well, you can be a communist and want to defeat Nazism, so we can't just ban all communists from having important jobs. But if you're still following the party after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, if you're still like actively taking part in Communist Party sort of propaganda and so on, then that's a sign that you might be willing to subvert the war effort. So what this meant is that the litmus test became, do you continue being an active member of the Communist Party after September 1939? And that's when they started, implementing restrictions on, what jobs you could take and so on. But for the vast majority of volunteers who don't necessarily abandon their political beliefs, but also don't, immediately re-embrace the Communist Party, actually face relatively few restrictions on what they do. There are certainly some cases where, people who were, getting interviewed for, temporary commissions in the army during the war, have a great interview, you'll hear from us soon. And then, a couple of weeks later, just get flatly rejected. And they sort of hypothesize it's because MI5, tapped someone on the shoulder and said, you can't trust this guy. But this is very much a minority experience. And what actually ends up happening, I found, is that MI5 comes to the conclusion that you're actually better off getting communists into the army, because if you're in the army, you've got relatively little mischief you can get up to. You're in a very regimented lifestyle. You're closely watched by your superiors. You can be kept tabs on very easily. Whereas if you leave communists in the workforce, this is where they've got experience organizing, they've got connections, they've got friends. They can actually do much more damage to the war effort by disrupting production than they can by, trying to subvert their comrades in the military. And so what you see is you get a lot of, kind of mid-ranking Communist Party members who actually end up in the army around 1940 and spend the entire war, manning searchlight batteries or something. They're kind of doing the less exciting work, where it's kind of perceived that they're going to be able to do less damage, even if they do manage to, subvert their comrades. So we see this conscious effort to kind of manage the limits of what British communists are allowed to do, and by extension, that included a large number of Spanish veterans. But I was unable to find really any evidence that purely on the basis of going to Spain, individuals were, denied, a posting or something. There's actually a really interesting source from MI5 where they actually launched an investigation of, a chap from a town called Blairgowrie in northeastern Scotland. And he'd applied to join the Home Guard. And there was, some questions raised by local police as to whether he was, of good enough character to join the Home Guard. Home Guard in, northeastern Scotland, probably not the most vital aspect of the war effort. But what happened is that you see this correspondence back and forth between sort of different police forces and different places where this man had lived, and you see, MI5 collating information. and they eventually come to the conclusion that he should not be allowed to serve in the Home Guard. What's really interesting is that this can't be because he went to Spain, because he declared that he went to Spain on his application to join the Home Guard. Because it asks you, what prior military experience do you have? And he says, well, I was in Spain from 1937 to 1938. I fought in these battles. So if that was enough to sort of bar him from joining, there wouldn't need to have been this big investigation of his character. And what actually emerges is the reason he's rejected is because he'd just been living in Glasgow in 1941, and he got a reputation in his place of work for communist agitation, for communist sort of subversion. In the words of his supervisor, he was fired for his abnormal communistic activities. And it's this record of activism during the war itself which gets him barred from joining the armed forces. And I think that's relatively typical, that, once the war actually starts, people don't care that much what you got up to in the 1930s. It's all about, what are you going to do now?
Now, before we end this fascinating conversation, I just have to ask about this, because in our weekly Fight a Free-for-All thread, you wrote that you're going to actually write a book. Tell me about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where I get to plug my book, and, sales will go through the roof, right? That's what happens on these podcasts, yeah? This is how you got me on here.
I hope so.
Okay, brilliant. I was really happy. So I finished my PhD last year. I've been working at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland ever since, and I was offered a contract in January to write a book based on my research to date. So looking at Scottish involvement in the Spanish Civil War. So I'll be looking at kind of domestic solidarity movements, as well as, who these volunteers are and what they got up to in Spain. I am theoretically writing it at the moment, much more theoretically than I'd like to be honest. There's far too much marking going on. But yeah, hopefully that's going to be coming out next year. Hopefully there's a paperback coming out the year after that. But yeah, it's very, very exciting, slightly intimidating, but also very exciting.
So please, everyone, you have to buy a copy whenever it comes out. Or hardback is good, but I obviously will forgive you if you buy the paperback. No worries.
Yeah, I'd say wait a year and buy the paperback. To be honest, I think the hardback is going to be maliciously overpriced, as these things tend to be. But hopefully, it's an interesting read.
That's why you have to tell your library to buy it in. Buy the really expensive hardback.
Yeah, buy many copies of the really expensive hardback. The students will need multiple copies, I'm sure.
With that said, is there any book that you recommend for curious readers right now about Spanish Civil War?
About the Spanish Civil War, I mean, there's kind of a classic few options. I mean, the one that gets recommended more than anything else is Hugh Thomas's, just called The Spanish Civil War. There's several different editions. There's one from the 60s, one from the 80s, one from, I think, about 2002. And this is, like one of those big doorstopper of books. And, this is, Hugh Thomas was amazingly knowledgeable about the conflict, and, has a really good grasp of, just all the different personalities and the politics and so on. After a slightly lighter read, Anthony Beevor has written The Battle for Spain, which is a very, very readable and clear account of what happens. I mean, Anthony Beevor is obviously a much more generalist in terms of his historical knowledge, and so he doesn't have the same, intimate grasp of things that Hugh Thomas did, but it's still a very good book. If you're looking for something on the International Brigades, there's actually a bit of a gap in English. So the last sort of broad account was a book called Fallen Sparrows by a man named Michael Jackson. I assume not the same Michael Jackson. That's from, I think, 1994. It's a very readable book. It is unfortunately dead wrong about some stuff. At least I think so. But, that's the latest sort of full-length book in English, and it is very, very readable. It's very evocatively written. If you're interested in, the people who came from your own country, there's bound to be, huge numbers of, different sort of national accounts available. So if you're in America, Peter Carroll has written The Odyssey of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. There's a slightly more conservative and skeptical account from Cecil Eby. I think it's called Between the Bullet and the Lie. If you're in Britain, Richard Baxall is probably the go-to person. He's written a couple of books on the British volunteers. I'll leave you to recommend the Swedish authors. But yeah, I mean, if anyone is more interested in these things or wants more reading recommendations, that's what Ask Historians is for. more than happy to answer follow-up questions on anything we've talked about here or any further recommendations for specialist reading.
For those interested in a Swedish book, there's the book No Pasarán, Spanska inbördeskriget och uppgörelsen med fascismen by Patrik Helgesson, Richard Jandel och Nils Weidegård, which is an edited compendium if you're interested in that. That was released in 2008. Fraser, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. Really, really love the work you guys do on this and, the whole sub in general, but particularly the podcast. Thanks so much for having me.
And it wouldn't be anything without you or our listeners. If you have any questions for Fraser, you're more than welcome to ask them in the thread that this podcast will be posted in.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.